All right. Hi, and welcome to everybody who's joining us in the PWOL Facebook group live right now, and anybody who's tuning in after the fact. So today we're talking with Steve Angle of Wesleyan University on a topic that comes up quite a bit in discussions about PWOL at the summer conferences, even here in this Facebook group, and is obviously a really important conversation and something I think a lot of us are thinking about as we continue to put together syllabi for this coming semester. So thank you, Steve, for being here. Let me just introduce you really briefly. Even though I'm sure everybody in the network knows Steve, he's the Mansfield Freeman Professor of East Asian Studies at Wesleyan University, also Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Center for Global Studies. So extremely busy, but welcome so much, and thanks for having this conversation, Steve.
Great to be here. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just share my screen. This will help us after the fact, hopefully navigate through the video for anybody who's kind of clicking through. So the first thing I want to start is just really broadly, Steve, by asking you what philosophy as a way of life looks like at Wesleyan. And I guess as background for anybody who might not know the whole story, one reason to ask this is because Wesleyan's been doing PWOL since before it was cool, or I guess it was cool even then, but has been doing PWOL for a long, long time. So yeah, if you could tell us a bit about the history of PWOL at Wesleyan and what it looks like today, I think that'd be a great place to start.
Absolutely. So every fall, I teach a course called Classical Chinese Philosophy, and that's sort of my bread and butter course to 35 to 40 students. And I'll talk more about this in a little while, but something I've always tried to do is to help students to sort of think their way into these rather different ideas, to evaluate them sort of from where they come from, see them where they live, and do that in a variety of ways. But I became aware quite a while ago now, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, that Amy Olberding at the University of Oklahoma had an assignment that I thought was really cool. And basically the idea was she asked her students to choose one of the texts that they had read in a course similar to mine. And there are a few steps which I can go through, but essentially come up with a way to live according to that text for 5 days, journal about it, and so on and so forth. And I thought, wait, this sounds great. This is exactly the sort of thing that I would like to get my students to do. And so it was really in that context that I started to think about this sort of immersive assignment that is many varieties of which now have become central to philosophy as a way of life. And I taught a first year only seminar called Philosophy as a Way of Life, maybe 10 years ago now, and used this as the final assignment. The syllabus was pretty diverse. We had some early and medieval Chinese texts, but also some Greek and Roman texts. We had Thoreau. We read a little bit of Pierre Hadot at the beginning, and so that's where I got going. And then two of my colleagues in particular, Tushar Rani and Stephen Horst, also partly independently. So Steve Horst had been teaching a course called Moral Psychology, Care of the Soul, that for again, a number of years, working with practitioners in some cases, psychotherapists and clergy. I did a guest gig in his course talking about Confucianism, and there too, there was a considerable emphasis on sort of experience and not just on reasoning. Tushar, I think his way in was through Stoic Week, so he's an expert on Greek and Roman philosophy, and he found that it worked really well for his students. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about why this stuff helps us to understand historical traditions in a second. But so he started doing this with Stoics and then decided, this would work with Platonists, Aristotelians, Epicureans and so on as well, and came up with a whole series of exercises for his students to do. So, we have other colleagues who are also interested in the relationship between philosophy and lived experience broadly, contemporary politics, and so on and so forth. So it's just kind of in the water, and we're all to one degree or another interested in this.
Yeah, and let me ask you too. So we've done a bit of work. We've met a couple of times to talk about a course that you're now designing, Steve and Tushar. And so maybe one thing that would be cool is if we could just like get out the structure of that class, just the basics of that and how you're thinking about designing it at the outset. We can kind of return to it throughout the conversation if it makes sense. But so yeah, that course is called Living a Good Life. And can you give me like the kind of the pitch or the way you guys are thinking about it as you put it together for this fall?
Yeah, so that is an effort to sort of take all of these ideas, the things that each of us have been doing, and to mash them up together into a larger class. That we're looking at maybe 60 students in this class, which is certainly big for a philosophy class at Wesleyan anyways. We have programmatic goals of, it's always good to have more students, more majors, and so on. And so we hope this is going to appeal to students who might not have been drawn into philosophy otherwise. But the general thought is to both do the sorts of things that we have each been doing in our courses independently. It helps that in courses that Tushar and Steve have been teaching on philosophy as a way of life in recent years, they have a course they've each taught called Live Like a Philosopher. They have brought in some Chinese texts and traditions, so they're somewhat familiar with the stuff that's my home turf. And we wanted both to really emphasize the way in which the lived experience and these exercises can help one get at the meat of the philosophy, but also in the other way, the way that these often quite ancient and distant texts can really speak to us today. So, as everybody who's listening knows, there's a lot of this stuff going around, from sort of positive psychology classes, different ways of approaching philosophy as a way of life. And our take is to very much rooted in individual experience, but also rooted in these different sorts of traditions. So we're going to the four we're going to focus on are Aristotle, classical Confucianism, mostly Mengzi and Xunzi, and Stoicism and Taoism. So we'll have bits of other things woven here and there, including some psychology, but those four traditions are the main ones that we're going to focus on.
That's awesome. So one thing I love about it is, we organize our course at Notre Dame on these 4 questions, and like the questions form the units, and these are the things we ask our students to respond to in their final essay and apology. So you guys are kind of taking a whole different approach. Instead of like organizing it topically, you're saying, we're going to take 1, 2, 3, 4 traditions and even sort of walk through each of those in some sort of sequence, right? So they'll be really immersed, not just in a particular class period, but they'll be immersed in a tradition for like a unit length amount of time. And I guess, I think you maybe mentioned this, but I'll just bring it up too. You guys are co-teaching it.
Right.
And so there'll be some sections where you're there together, leading the students through an exercise. There'll be some where you take them individually. There'll be some element of peer-led dialogue. It's got all the PWOL elements. It's going to be super exciting.
That's the idea, and we're very appreciative to the support that you all at the Mellon Project are giving us as we think through, how it needs to not just be the kitchen sink, but everything needs to fit together. We want to have themes that so that there's a sort of arc to the class. It's not just you do one thing and then you do a very different thing. Our themes are going to be things like engagement, freedom, attention, issues that come up in different ways throughout these different traditions.
This is one of the things I love about PWOL classes is whenever I hear a new one pitched, I'm like, I want to take that one. Like, I want to go be part of that. So let me let's see, share my screen again and shift gears just a little bit and ask you. So one thing that's also really cool, I think, about your approach, and one thing that we learn a ton from every time we talk to you guys is making sure that students are really immersed in a particular philosophical tradition. And often, that means like helping them get inside a particular text and a particular time period and thinking really seriously about it. So one thing, just question I have for you is, in general, if you have tips or techniques or course level thoughts on what the best way is to help students really appreciate a particular tradition. And I'm putting it's kind of poorly, but metaphorically here, from the inside, like how do you facilitate that?
Right. I don't think that's a poor way to put it at all. I think that on the one hand, things can't be too alien. We can't say, no, sorry, incommensurable. You can't understand it from where you are. So it has to be, a way in. It has to be familiar enough. For starters, none of the texts that our students are reading were originally written in English. We're using translations, of course, but there's a much broader sort of translation that's going on and making it accessible to often first-year students. But if you go too far in that direction, too far in the direction of sort of naturalizing it or making it familiar, then I think you lose something really important. And so everybody's going to hit that balance a little bit differently, but you use the word kind of holism a few times, right? That there's this sense of being it's not just one class or one comparison within a class, but a unit of the class, where we're really trying to have students immerse themselves in the text, the vocabulary, the perspectives of these distinctive traditions. And one way I like to put it is, this is a way of taking the tradition and its concepts, its values, its arguments seriously, and not just as point of comparison with something else, which is the thing that you're really centering, but rather taking this tradition itself as central. A story I think you probably have heard me tell before, Paul, but the very first time I taught a course on Neo-Confucianism, so this is medieval Confucianism from about the 10th century down to the 18th century. Halfway through, we're talking about Zhu Xi, the 12th century Neo-Confucian great. And a student comes up to me after class and says that, Professor Engel, this is the most relevant class I have taken at Wesleyan.
That's awesome.
And that was a bit of a shock and a little worrying at first. But as we talked about it, it was clear that it was because we really were, I was asking them to say, take the Confucian notion of coherence or pattern, Li, right? This is a big, important, central, complicated metaphysical notion, and use this to think about how to understand a dispute that you've had with your roommate, right? And so, as Zhu Xi would, if you ask Zhu Xi, how do I make sense of this dispute with my roommate, he would avail himself of this sort of an idea. So you should be able to too, right? So not just to know how Li relates to Qi, but to be able to use it, apply it to new contexts, right? So that's sort of understanding it from the inside.
Yeah. So let me, yeah. So as a kind of quick follow-up, do you find that it's more difficult to students, or for students to really get into and like inhabit the worldview, or to kind of separate their own views from the worldview once they're inside? Or maybe this is just some, I don't know, maybe these are both challenges, but I wonder which is the more difficult move. And I could give you, I guess, a concrete sort of way of asking the question if that wasn't clear enough, but.
No, I know what you mean. And I think it depends on the student and it depends on the worldview, because our students come in with different sorts of backgrounds, different sorts of assumptions, and these worldviews are themselves distinct, right? So one way to think about this is, in my classical Chinese philosophy course, when the students are choosing a text to live in accord with for 5 days, I tell them to try to choose something that is more different from their sort of existing predilections, as opposed to one that feels more familiar. I had a student, really terrific student in the class a number of years ago, who decided he was going to live like Zhuangzi, the Taoist Zhuangzi, which is all about sort of wandering and play and so on and so forth. Well, it turned out he was pretty good with wandering and play already.
Sure.
And he found it relatively difficult to tell what was different in his life as he was trying to live in accord with Zhuangzi. Now, surely there would have been ways, right, to change things.
Sure.
But for him, it was too familiar. So he should have chosen Confucianism and trying to be, overtly dutiful, filial to his parents and so on in ways that I think would have been much more challenging and interesting for him.
That's really cool. So let me ask you another kind of big picture question, but I think this is a challenge that a lot of people thinking about designing PWOL courses, it's at least in the background as they're thinking about it, maybe because this is one of the motivations, but we find, as we're starting to think about introducing students to philosophy, and especially trying to do that in an innovative way, not like the old style sort of intro course where there's a set syllabus. We find that like once we've set our learning goals, decided what the students are going to be doing, we take a step back, we look at the syllabus and we look at the calendar of readings, and then we inevitably find that we've got a pretty narrow set of thinkers from a pretty like distinct period of time. And I think a lot of us in the PWOL community feel that as kind of a challenge. Like, how do we get a little bit further outside our comfort zone? How do we teach somebody that we might not have learned about necessarily in grad school, but we think is really important and, has a distinctive PWOL sort of thing to offer? And so I guess I'll pitch that to you as somebody who is much more comfortable, teaching traditions that, again, I think a lot of us really would like to adopt. I guess I'll ask you, why do you think that's important if it is? And why do we all feel that? Why do we feel guilty, Steve? Why do we feel this desire to broaden up our curriculum?
Yeah, so really two big questions: why to do it and how to do it, right? And so let me say a little bit about why to do it. First of all, I think there is an obvious value in a less parochial, more inclusive sense of what philosophy is, right? I think we should all be thinking about that and worried to the extent that that's not happening. It isn't necessarily easy. I think actually in the context of a PWOL course, it's easier than in other contexts to get going. But that sort of meta value, I think, is just important. So if we believe that, we should act on that. One reason why a less Eurocentric approach can be another sort of higher level reason why a less Eurocentric approach can be interesting is that for a lot of non-European philosophical traditions, reason is not as centered as it is in the European philosophical tradition. And of course, we could talk about, okay, is it really philosophy, et cetera? I think, there's very powerful answers to that question. But reason is unusually, privileged in the Greek tradition and the traditions following therefrom. And it's reasoning and so on is really important to the Chinese, the Indians, and other traditions, but not in exactly the same way. So that in itself, I think, can be really eye-opening.
Follow up on that really quick.
Sure.
So this is like, I'm outside my comfort zone now, Steve. You brought me there, which is great. And so I'll ask something that, like, I don't mean this, but I hear in the back of my head somebody saying, okay, but wait a second. Like, if we're not privileging reason in the discussion, then in what sense is this philosophy such that I can understand and describe it as philosophy? Because I often just like go to philosophy as love of truth. I mean, I go straight to like Plato and Aristotle. And so, even just like a really conceptual, like basic conceptual question I have is like, how would I introduce a less reason-centered, non-Eurocentric tradition as philosophy to my students, or even to myself? How should I think about it?
Right. So I think that there's a distinction between the sort of practice that philosophers in Greece and Rome engaged in, and to some degree, their self-understanding of what that practice was. Right. So if you characterize what they did as a reasoned engagement with the large questions about the cosmos, about our place in the cosmos, how to live, and so on and so forth, that's fine. That's inclusive.
Hmm.
And it's not about simply, appeals to authority or so on and so forth. We can have different views of the importance of traditions, et cetera. So authority is complicated itself.
Mm-hmm.
But what you see in many of these other traditions is that the place of reason, sort of reason with a capital R, and the centrality of truth. Not that we don't want to speak the truth, but saying that seeking the truth, that is the central thing that we should be doing, as opposed to, say, being concerned with the good or the beautiful and so on and so forth. Or maybe we conceptualize these things quite differently. And so things that are present to one degree or another in the European tradition, but in different mixes, and are very much subsidiary in the self-understanding of this changing practice, are more important, more central in other traditions. And then this is about seeing the difference that makes.
That's cool and really helpful. The way that I'm thinking about it, this is like as a total beginner, is now looking at the difference between what Plato's doing and what he thinks he's doing. Or I guess, in the dialogues, sort of the difference between what's being depicted and the self-understanding of Socrates, say. There is a huge gap there, right? And the sort of interpretive gap might allow me to kind of open up like an approach to other figures who might just not be under an illusion about what they're trying to do, as much of an illusion, right? So it's, maybe they appreciate that the project isn't so rationalistic. I don't know. I'm using a lot of words here, throwing around a lot of, but
I think that's right. And, another way this comes out, I think, is if you compare, so there's this debate, which is, I think, pretty generative to a lot of people's thinking about philosophy as a way of life, that slogan, between, on the one hand, Adot's approach, talking about spiritual exercises and so on and so forth, and then John Cooper, right? The way that he says, well, sort of, but his understanding of philosophy as a way of life is capital REASON centered, much more, I would say, than Adot, even though Adot is also talking about the Greeks and Romans. And so I think it's really this sort of the Cooper's notion of what philosophy as a way of life can be, and that and limits there too, that I think are good for us to understand how limited that is. And looking to other traditions can help us do that.
All right, so I have another question, a concrete question, but first, one more bit of consulting. I guess this is just like me being selfish, but can I understand it like this? Sometimes I think, for the same reason that some people tell me that particular religious traditions aren't really philosophy, Catholicism, that's not just philosophy. There's a bunch of other stuff added onto that, right? But a lot of people I know think no, Catholicism is my philosophy, right? And they have this very distinct view about the sort of relationship between faith and reason, but they think it's all philosophy. Might this be might thinking about a religious tradition be a way into some of these other traditions as well? Or do you think the disanalogies between contemporary religions like Catholicism, say, and the other traditions make that unhelpful?
Well, I think it's tricky because just as philosophy, is understood in a particular way within the European tradition, so religion is understood in a particular way within the European tradition. And I think that there are lots of things that are philosophies that are religions or religious in an inclusive sense, that are also philosophies or philosophizing in an inclusive sense. So whereas, Plato might have wanted to really differentiate those in a sharp way, and certainly modern philosophers have wanted to differentiate, modern European, American, North American philosophers have wanted to differentiate those in a sharp way. In other contexts, other places, other traditions, not so much. So I do think it's a way in. I don't want somebody to come away thinking, oh, all right, so we've got philosophy, and that's European philosophy, and then we've got religion, which is everything else. And what you're saying is, let's pretend that these religions are philosophy, right? So
sure.
so you don't want to break it up that way. I do want to add, though, that one thing that happens when you ask people to take other traditions seriously in the way that I've been doing, which includes the sort of exercises that there's a lot of other kinds of exercises, but this sort of immersive practical exercises that we're talking about. Something that comes up is, but wait, this is against my faith, or are you asking me to convert to something, or right? What all is going on here? And I think that is those sorts of tensions can be handled. They're actually ultimately very productive. They're generative of what people call intercultural competence. Learning to sort of deal with ambiguity and maybe have a little bit of a lessened grip on yourself of the commitments that you brought to the conversation. So there's a whole lot more one could say, I think, about how these sorts of commitments, faith, if you will, religion, and so on and so forth, play into this sort of more diverse, open way of thinking about philosophy as a way of life.
That is really interesting. Oh man, I want to spend all the rest of our time on that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to resist that, and I'm going to ask you. So let's see, I'll share the slides again and ask just in a really concrete way. Okay, so I'm a PWOL instructor. I want to diversify my course. I want to incorporate more from the traditions that you all are teaching a whole course on this fall, but I don't know where to start. So I'll ask you, where should I start, Steve?
Yeah, well, so it's a really good question. I don't think there's any sort of one automatic answer. What I'll say is one thing to think about is themes that you're interested in, because there are sort of relatively easy points of entry into some non-European traditions, and sort of locating those points of entry can enable you to feel a little bit more comfortable, have a little bit more of a sort of understanding of what's at stake. And also, if you're trying to integrate this into a class, make it less sort of, well, this week we're going to be doing the other, rather have it be more unified. So I think things like the environment, virtue, reflection, transcendence, for starters, are all places where there's quite ready points of entry and similarity, contrast with a variety of different non-Western traditions. So that sort of thematic approach, I think, is a good idea. The good news is that for a lot of traditions now, there are excellent translations, multiple translations of key texts. There's good secondary literature. There's frankly good stuff on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and resources like that to get going. So I think that there's the next step after you decide, well, maybe I want to think about the environment, and so and depends on who your students are and what might resonate with them, be adequately different but not too different. And then maybe the last thing to say, at least for the moment, about that is, and be brave, go for it. What's the worst that can happen? It's not like you're going to get sued for malpractice by the Chinese Philosophers Association or something like that. I think that the philosophers engaged in this kind of enterprise are in general super welcoming, and there is a group that's not so welcoming, and those tend to be the sort of text specialist historian types. They're not so welcoming to me. Sure. Right? Wait a minute, you're calling this philosophy? Well, that word did not exist in 3rd century BCE, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I know.
So you'll back us up, like if
I'll back you up, absolutely.
Them, all right, we'll just be like, hey, Steve said it was okay. So here's okay. So this is good, and this is all really helpful. And I think for me, it's confidence building. But I want to get like super mega concrete and ask you to consult on the following case. Okay. So I'm putting together a syllabus, and let's just use our course as an example. We have the 4 questions, kind of have units like an epistemology unit, ethics unit, et cetera. And
Yep.
each of the days we give students a big claim, right? So we say, doubt everything. And then we kind of
Right.
pitch that day as like, we're Socrates and we're kind of like, going to bat for Socrates' view, or
Right.
I guess this is actually Descartes' day, whatever. So each of the days has a claim. We got a text from an author, and we're trying to kind of embody that position and defend it in class. Okay, so I want to be brave, and I want to say, for one of the particular days, our claim is going to be respect authority, and we're going to use Confucius, and we're going to use kind of the virtue ethical framework that he's sharing with Aristotle. And we've already talked in our class about the importance of community and the importance of other people and living a good life and flourishing, etc. And now I want to do this, but I only have like at most maybe 4 hours to like really prep myself up and write a lecture on this or design an in-class activity. Do you think that's, is that insane? I mean, I'll spend some time on the SEP and I'll read some stuff. I'll read a couple overviews. But I guess my question is, am I being brave if I then just go for it and try to do that in class? Or, I guess the fear here is like, am I kind of being too cavalier? And like, I'm just going to be like, somebody who knows nothing going into a classroom saying like, okay, well, everybody, here's exactly what Confucius thought. I wouldn't present it like that, but you know what I mean?
Well, so, right, the question is, how would you present it?
Yeah.
Would you present it as, if you present yourself as overly ignorant, then maybe you don't engage the students. They're like, well, why should I pay attention to what you're saying? But I think that the texts are intrinsically intriguing enough, and they tend to be accessible enough, at least if you're choosing well starting out here, that it's not that hard to get it going. And it's fine if the question that you raise, which you think is super, super interesting, is, been discussed to death for 1,000 years, right? Who cares? It hasn't been discussed to death for 1,000 years in your classroom with these students. So, I think that I don't see the downside. And especially if it, plants a seed. And you say, okay, I'm going to do this again next year, but I'm going to spend 4 more hours, sort of refreshing, but also reading something else. And it's not that hard to do. I think you chose actually a really good case. Right? There's a super famous, super controversial passage from the Analects where Confucius is lauding somebody who his father has killed a sheep of a neighbor, and he conceals his father from the police. He doesn't turn him in, right? So what's going on with that, right? Is this just, unthinking obedience to his father's authority and sort of private familial relations trump any sort of civic duty and so on and so forth?
Yeah.
Well, no, but it's more like that than you might have thought. And there's really good secondary literature about this that's easy enough to find, that can get you going. So you got your 4 hours of reading. You'll have a few passages that your students can sink their teeth into, and then some great stuff to think about. And obviously, easy comparisons to draw with Plato, with other folks from the Western tradition that have thought about relevantly similar issues, but in a different perspective.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. So here's a question I'll pitch to you, but also to anybody watching either live on Facebook or on the YouTube channel after the fact. So I'll ask anybody who has thoughts to post their thoughts in the comments. But okay, so my question is this. From your sort of position of expertise, anything that you feel really comfortable in, like as an expert, what are the resources that you might, and maybe we could even just name a couple that you would recommend to me to read for like an hour, just to say like, oh yeah, okay, I'm going to use this figure. And so as an example, I think, I'm so embarrassed that I'm blanking on the name right now, but there's this excellent short introduction to Anscombe that if you read the intro, if you read just like 3 to 5 pages of the intro, you're just going to get what's important about intention, and you'll know I can totally do this on a day of class or not. I'm going to post that in the comments afterwards. I'll post a link to it. I also think John Schwenkler's book, if you want to go more in depth, or if you were deciding for a grad seminar, just read the first couple of pages, right, of the intro. So is there anything like that with any of the traditions or the thinkers that you teach? Like, here's the book, or just here's the SEP article. And again, if anybody's watching, from your point of view as experts and whatever you're experts in, drop those links in the comments. But what about for you, Steve? Where would you start with a couple of thinkers?
So I think that, one way to answer the question is, a couple of years ago, I taught a course called Global Philosophy. And one of the things we did in the class was look at sort of methodological questions. What is philosophy? What do we think philosophy is now, and why, and so on and so forth. But there was also a section of the class where I wanted to do just this whirlwind tour of world philosophical traditions. So, one day for East Asia, one day for Europe, and so on, and a whole bunch of different places. And I found great resources myself, where, I don't know a heck of a lot about some of these traditions. I know a lot about Chinese philosophy, and, something about Korean and Japanese, and of course, my undergraduate and graduate training had lots of European and North American philosophy as well, but not so much Indian, very little African or more contemporary Africana, and so on and so forth. So the very short histories that are out there. There's a very short history of Indian philosophy, very short history of Islamic philosophy, and so on. I thought were great starting points. And in fact, often chapter 1, which is your 4 or 5 pages, was really good to get the students oriented really quickly. So for that kind of thing, if I'm talking about Chinese philosophy, then one way to go is, if you want to do Confucius, Mengzi, Mencius is probably the place to start. And a good translation has got a good introduction that's going to tell you what the key issues are. The easiest way into Mengzi is probably Brian Van Noorden's Essential Mengzi. So read the beginning there. But again, on a lot of these things, there's good stuff online that you can get started with even before you've got a physical book in your hand.
That's awesome. That's really helpful. And the short histories, that's the series, right? The little, okay, that's what I was thinking of. And Rachel Wiseman is the name of the Hanscom scholar I was thinking of.
Very good.
And I'm not sure if it's the very short, but it's it's also a Routledge guidebook kind of that I was thinking of. But the Brian Van Noorden, that's great. I'll just put a link to that in the comments, and a link to the series that you had mentioned, and the more general thoughts about where to look are super helpful. All right, so at this point, what I'll do is I'll give you the last word. And if there's anything else you want to say to the PWOL community watching from around the world, I'll let you say it, and then and then I'll thank you, and then we'll head out. But any last thoughts on designing diverse traditions-based PWOL courses, Steve?
So I think that in my experience these days, there aren't that many the sort of meta doubt of is this stuff philosophy? Is it interesting? So on and so forth. That's not the big challenge. Yeah, there's some people out there who say that kind of stuff, but I don't think that's the big challenge. I think the big challenge is people who have this kind of vague unease at the parochialism of the way that they teach, that their departments are organized, the way the discipline seems to still be largely constructed, and don't know what to do about it. And I think that thinking that the bar to doing something about it is too high is one of the main stumbling blocks at this point. So going back to this idea of sort of courage, of taking a step, I think just go for it, right? 4 hours is enough, in your example. And I think that what you'll find is the students will respond. You've got a diverse group of students in your classroom, whatever exactly the makeup is. And they will enjoy seeing some other stuff. Maybe it's stuff that they relate to a little bit better for one reason or another, or at any rate, just is providing more options. So I think it's going to be good for your teaching. I think it's generative for our thinking as philosophers, and it can be professionally beneficial. I did a NEH summer seminar years ago together with Michael Sloat on virtue ethics and Confucianism. And all the folks who came and did it were people without any significant prior background in Confucianism. They were interested in virtue ethics and thought this sounded cool. And almost all of them went on to find professional success doing comparative work or doing work even just on China, right? So just as one can write really profound things about Plato without having much Greek, right? You can't, there's a certain kind of scholarship you obviously can't do. And it helps that it's an alphabetic language, and so you can say phronimos and things like that without having worried about messing up the tones too badly like you would with Chinese. But you can do serious Greek philosophy without Greek, and you can do serious Chinese philosophy without Chinese, up to a certain level, right? And up to certain kinds of stuff. So there's room.
Yeah, that's inspiring. I mean, I'm inspired. I think people should think about the PWOL community in general, but also very specifically here in the Facebook group as a great place to continue to build that courage and share resources. I know I've already gotten tons of great ideas about particular class periods or activities from other people in the group. So I think it'd be great if we thought of the PWOL community broadly as a place where you can try things out and share resources and collaborate, build up the virtues. I liked you said something like it's good for our thinking and good for us professionally. It's good for our souls too.
Absolutely.
To think about these things and to try to incorporate them in a meaningful way in our teaching. Okay, so here's where I'll say thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate your taking the time to talk to us. This is going to be really valuable for the PWOL community. And thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Paul.
All right, we'll log off. Thank you so much.
All righty.